on the 21st of September, when the General Assembly and world leaders formally marked the 75th anniversary, they adopted with unanimity the UN 75 Declaration. And that highlighted the 7 major priorities for the UN moving forward. And it set out 5 priorities for improving the organization. And the 70 priorities were the decade of action for the Sustainable Development Goals, climate change and the environment, dealing better with protracted conflict, promoting gender equality, upholding international law, overcoming discrimination and exclusion, and working better together in the digital realm. And they anticipated improving in all these areas by making the UN more inclusive, especially bringing in more voices of youth and other stakeholders, by improving the financing of the UN, by strengthening the partnerships of the UN beyond governments, and by making sure that the UN is better prepared to deal with unforeseen emergencies like that represented by the pandemic. So I think the member states themselves, world leaders, agreed on an agenda. The Secretary General has been tasked with setting out details of how this agenda can be implemented, and then it will be for all to take action within that agenda. But I think that represents a very strong forward-looking perspective for reinvigorating the work of the organization around the priorities identified by member states. I think all global leaders, by definition, tend to put the interests of their own citizens first. There's nothing new or different in that regard. I think what we have to recognize is that in a world where the planet is suffering from so many threats, we cannot safely protect the interests of our own citizens. We cannot put their interests first unless we also think globally, unless we also think about the interests of others. Solidarity towards those who are further afield, further away, is necessary precisely to put, to think appropriately and in a responsible way of our own citizens. So it's not an either or, either you think nationally or you think internationally. In today's world, you have to think both. I mean, I think you probably always had to think both, but today more than ever, no amount of thinking purely national is going to help you with climate change. No amount of thinking purely national is going to help you with COVID. No amount of purely national is going to help you with sustainable economic growth. All these things, you have to think international. You have to understand and recognize and cater to what's happening in other parts of the world. And above all, you have to recognize that solidarity, if while conflict that is happening far away very quickly comes back to us. It can come back to us through international terrorism. It can come back to us through migration threats. It can come back to us through global health threats. So far off threats very quickly come to our shores. So I think the 21st century, we really need to get off this national versus international. You can't be a good nationalist without also being a good internationalist. And I think younger people, and that came out of our UN 75 exercise, younger people really understand that and really see themselves both as nationals and patriots of this or that country and as global citizens, and they don't see any contradiction. Well, the United Nations, as the name implies, the United Nations is most affected when indeed we're a collection of nations who, at least in many respects, are united. And when we are united, great things can happen. We steered a process of decolonization in dozens of countries. The world managed to avert a nuclear confrontation and a third world war, thanks to unity. The arms control was introduced thanks to that unity. Numerous peace agreements were negotiated thanks to unity. The unity allowed for the formulation of the Global Development Agenda not so long ago, the Sustainable Development Goals, just 5 years ago. It allowed for the Paris Climate Accord. But now we're at a time of great disunity, and that does mean that we are not as effective as we could be. And we see that in the huge difficulties, the huge amount of work that goes into the Security Council really to gain very little. And there's, that makes the resolution of conflicts, that makes more difficult. It makes the advancing on climate change much more difficult. It makes the handling of COVID much more difficult. But I think we need to find our way back to greater unity. And there are some signs where with unity, progress has been made. There's progress, even if it's unequal in the war in Yemen. An uneasy ceasefire in Hodeidah has saved thousands of lives. There's progress in the peace process in Central Africa, in South Sudan. So there are areas where we're seeing some progress. And without global cooperation through WHO, we can also be sure that the COVID response, for all its inadequacies, would have been far, far worse, especially for the most vulnerable and the poorer countries. So we clearly need greater unity to become more effective, but we will not cease to strive for that and to work on the basis of the unity we can still find. Well, China has a tremendously important role. China is a founding member. China is one of the largest countries in the world, one of the most rapidly growing economies. China is a member of the P5. And so for all those reasons and many more, China has a very important role in the United Nations. And I think the growing commitment that we've witnessed in recent years and growing investment of China in international cooperation is extremely welcome. And that, for long, China has been involved in supporting the work of the UN in development, in sustainable development, in South-South cooperation. And I think these new commitments that President Xi made around climate control and the target of making China carbon neutral by 2060 is extremely important. The issue of environmental degradation and biodiversity is the major issue of our time, and China's commitment is very important. And of course, China, as a P5 member of the Security Council, has a particular responsibility. And China happens to be the second contributor now to peacekeeping. And of all the P5 members, the one with most troops actually in peacekeeping missions. And China's role in helping build consensus and find agreement at a time when there's so much division in the Security Council, and that division is very harmful to international peace and security. China's key contribution in helping find agreement is absolutely critical. So China has a key role to play in all pillars of the UN: peace and security, sustainable development, and now also in climate. And I think the hope is also that on the human rights front, we'll be able to see more leadership from China.